Hello, I'm Giles Bailey. I'm a policy advisor at Vianova, a mobility management company working across Europe. As part of our industry engagement and thought leadership work, we've been running a series of webinars on the most topical mobility issues. This is our 8th, and the others are available via our website. We have been witnessing changes in global mobility brought about by new business models, innovation, micromobility. This is supporting as well as challenging classic transport modes. And now we have the unprecedented turmoil in cities around the world brought about by the COVID pandemic. While much has occurred in mobility, the mobility market in 2020 and into 2021, in this webinar, we would like to examine the wider issue of curb space management, and particularly what a data-led process managing the increasing number of delivery vehicles in our cities can mean for delivering sustainability and livability. For cities, this is one of the next major mobility challenges. To start off, I'll just give a few thoughts to lay context, and then we'll get into our excellent panel of speakers. So the UN has forecast and demonstrated that the world is urbanizing. Up to 70% of the population of the world now lives in cities, and often very, very large cities, and that continues to increase. This is leading to congestion in cities all over the world, and much thought about how we design and deliver a sustainable mobility in an urban context. That said, many people are actually asking about our streets and what our streets are actually for. Deliveries, vehicles, or actually for people and people-centered modes of transport. During the pandemic, we've seen a collapse in mobility, but in cities around the world, that mobility is rapidly coming back, particularly in terms of car use, but does raise the question in the longer term about building a resilient mobility system in the post-COVID world. But looking more generally, quite positively, investment in public transport is largely continued in this period of crisis, if not intensified. And this includes light rail, heavy rail, but actually in micromobility, street-level transport as well, and that trend seems to continue. It also has led, though, to new ways of working and new ways of living, and particularly the rise of at-home working, and consequently, fewer people going to central city offices. And all of that has led to challenges around deliveries, what the services, types of services, the range of services, and the intensity of services that people expect at their household. And again, that's raising a whole series of challenges. But going forward, cities are looking at how they manage parking. This rise in deliveries is leading to more congestion, more carbon emissions. There are a whole range of ways in which it's challenging the livability of our cities. And although there are many user cases when we look at deliveries, in this webinar in particular, I think we'd like to go beyond the purely electrification of deliveries and e-deliveries, but actually looking at how we manage the space in our cities to actually, again, make them livable and sustainable. It takes us to the wider issues of the EU Green Deal and how we're supporting fundamental changes to deliver the challenges of climate change, the future post-COVID in mobility, but actually fundamental questions about data and a data-centered policy in delivering transport, and ultimately how we deliver for clean, livable, safe, and sustainable cities. So over the next hour, we're going to have a range of speakers. We're going to have 5 speakers. Each will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. There'll be a short question and answer session with myself. We'll go through the entire panel, and then we'll have probably about half an hour for an interactive discussion across the entire group. Your questions are welcome, and so please type them into the Q&A box, and I'll work those into the debate as we go throughout the entire webinar. We hope to finish just after the next hour, because we have a lot to cover. It should just take slightly over an hour. But to start with, and I'd like to welcome Efren Lara from McCree Consulting. Efren is a senior consultant at McCree, and he's worked there for 17 years in planning local and continent-wide transport networks. He has a focus on logistics, including maritime as well as European transport policy. The CRE has been assisting the city of Barcelona and other local ecosystem partners on freight delivery thinking for a number of years, and today he is representing the city. Efren, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gilles. Okay, so thank you all for being here. I'm going to present some of the works undertaken during the last about 5 years by ATM, which is not like in English. ATM in this case stands for Authority of Metropolitan Transportation, which is the agency in Catalonia, which is in charge of several aspects related to public transportation. If you may manage to move one slide, please. Yeah. So the ATM is a consortium, and it's made up mainly between the regional government, Generalitat, and the local city government. And it has several functions, as you may see here, about planning infrastructure, planning new mobility services, defining the policy behind the fares, financing of some of the public transport systems, some management, and other things. One of the aspects that the ATM is working on is developing. Please go to the next slide. It's the master plan for organizing mobility in the Barcelona metropolitan area, which is called PDM, Pla Director de Mobilitat. And this plan, which the last version ended in 2018, but a new one came up, tries to define a series of measures linked, among many other things, to urban logistics. And urban logistics is something which is taking more and more relevance, especially in this last period. And the plan proposes a series of different measures to be implemented, which are organized in different thematic pillars that we are seeing right here. And some of these are in process of being implemented. Some are still on the future pipeline. Okay, so lots of work to do yet. The next one, please. So the first major action that was undertaken was to analyze the different municipal ordinances on urban distribution of goods. And I mean, this is not something very technological, it's very straightforward, but the analysis shed some interesting facts, which is that, for example, there's a lack of normative, especially in smaller towns around Barcelona, and different norms, which result in lots of difficulties for the end user. For example, it happens in some of our cities that a street, which is the border between two different towns, has different schedules at either side for loading and unloading areas. And even there are different maximum allowances for truck weight, which of course makes it a nightmare for users to proceed, because you can be fined in one of the cities and not in the other, depending on what you are doing. So this is something complex. So in order to overcome this, next one, please. We prepared for ATM, for Autoritat de Transport Metropolità, an online portal, something which in the beginning was very simple, that has been more complex in time. And this portal allows us to store information about available municipal ordinances which regulate this urban logistics. That's the first and most basic layer. The next one, please. If we go into a bit further detail, we see that we can also display information about details of the regulation of the different loading and unloading zones, the maximum time allowed for parking, the limitation on maximum allowed weight, how the regulation is carried out, if night distribution, for example, is allowed or not. And we show that we try to show that in a simple way using visual icons. But this is just aggregated information at municipality level. So what we've done this past year is to go one step further. And in the next slide, please, we will see that we've been adding very fine details about location and normative associated to each one of the individual loading and unloading places in several cities. I can imagine this is something that has been done at other places in the world, but in our case in Catalonia, this was not done yet. There were some local initiatives. For example, the city of Barcelona itself already did a good job with that. And in the next slide, please, we may see that the different informations that we have on this system come mainly from 3 different sources. First, there are some open data repositories, which, as I said, is the case of Barcelona and some other big cities that have already information on the location on their loading and unloading zones. Also information on the details on which times they open, when they are free to park and so on. But it was the case that after analyzing the data, there were many errors there. And there was a task of homogenization of data across the different municipalities. A second source of information are specific geographic layers that are provided by the municipalities themselves, but of course they have to be adapted in order to be integrated into the system. And third, and maybe the most interesting one, is the manual digitalization of the different individual places using tools that we provide in the portal. And all this data that is introduced manually is introduced by the municipalities themselves. So we are crowdsourcing the information, and we expect that the municipalities are able to maintain this data in the future. There are not so many changes every day about which place is open or closed for loading and unloading, but in any case, we offer that option. And so the idea is that we have a very up-to-date database of all the location of these loading and unloading places. Next one, please. And finally, we have in this portal, we have other kinds of informations which might be useful also for the end user. And in this case, for complementing this urban logistic information, we provide a layer with the location of parking areas for heavy good vehicles. Again, by using icons, we show information on the facilities, for example, provided at each one of the locations so that the users may plan what to do and how to do it. And last one, please. Yeah, the layers can be shown in different ways. So it's thematic. We show them depending on the available features, location and management and so on. But let's say that the main idea behind this portal is that local and regional administrations are able to provide all kinds of relevant information in order to facilitate operation on urban logistics. And the data is, of course, free to access. And we expect that in the near future, third parties will be able to consume the data and offer it, for instance, via application for mobile phones. Okay. And this is, of course, only the beginning. And as the next big step will be to start adding sensors to the curb in order to allow for real-time management of the space. But however, this is something to be further discussed and developed on the coming years. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. Again, just one relatively quick question, although a very big issue. Getting accurate, up-to-date information from the cities. I know you've used crowdsourcing information as well. Can you perhaps kind of encompass some of the bigger challenges you had about getting that kind of right data together in one place to enable your project to go forward?
Yeah, in fact, the first step was to make a sample of different kinds of situations we were expecting to find. And so, well, yeah, it's different. As I said, in the case of Barcelona city, it's very easy. They have a CSV file online that you can download and everything is there. Although it has some errors inside, you can manage that. You have to believe that the information is correct. Of course, it might not be the case. There are some things that change, and maybe maybe no one has updated the CSV file and so on, but okay, these are minor things. In the case of the other municipalities, some of them are very easy because you talk to someone from the local government of the city, and they already know by heart that, you know, and they tell you, no, I know that we have 4 places in the city and they are on those streets. And then you just simply go there, you go to for example, when you go to Street View in Google Maps, and you can check that. You can check it, but not always, because sometimes the image in Google Maps is 3, 4, 10 years old, and the street has changed a lot. You have lots of changes in the type of well, on how the street is developed, and I mean there are lots of changes, and so the reality might be another thing. But yeah, the idea is to get information from local people, and that they themselves can introduce the data. In fact, that's what we offer with the tools we develop, because we know it's an impossible task for just 1, 2, 3 people to try to cover all that ground. So that's why we want to involve everyone, because in that way it's easy to manage. And moreover, this is something that we still have not implemented, but we are discussing it. The idea is that the end users might have some feedback tool in order to provide us with information, telling, okay, this place is no longer operative, or you are missing this one here. And so that's something that can be done with this kind of infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we'll come back to the data availability and getting the right data to enable a data-led look at deliveries to be relevant later on in the various discussions. But next, I'd like to introduce Eduardo Green. And Eduardo has been the Mobility Innovation Manager within the Smart Mobility team at the City of Amsterdam over the last 2 years. He has previously worked for 3 years in the pharmaceutical industry and 8 years in internal audit functions. Prior to taking up his role in the City of Amsterdam, he had studied data management in Manchester in the UK. Over to you, Eduardo.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Eduardo Green. I am an innovation manager and a service designer working within the Smart Mobility team for the municipality of Amsterdam. And I'm just going to walk you through today some of our logistics challenges that we have in the city, and some of the projects that we're doing to try and address and explore these challenges. Next, please. So this is a slide that we always like to start with in Smart Mobility, not least of all because we have our program objectives on the right-hand side. But what you're seeing in this slide is a man who's called Norman Bell Geddes. And this is a picture from the 1939 World Fair that's being held in New York City. And the exhibition was called Futurama. And in this picture, what they're doing is they're actually designing car-centric cities. Cars are becoming more accessible, they're becoming more affordable, and here they're actually getting together to understand how cities can become more car-centric. And it's often regarded as the place where terms such as the expressway and suburbia were invented. Next, please. So, of course, a lot has changed. We don't design car-centric cities anymore, quite the opposite. We design human-centric cities. But of course, within human-centric cities, there is no such thing as a city without logistics. Without it, we don't have shops, we don't have supermarkets, restaurants, bars, postal services, hospitals, constructions, renovation, you name it. And so it takes a great deal of thought about how we manage our streets and our public space, including our curbside management. Next. And what we see is that transformation is needed and it's happening. And I'm pleased to say that in Amsterdam, we see quite a number of these solutions that you see on the right-hand side, these light electric vehicles, cargo bikes, and these things are being largely driven by commercial organizations themselves, which is pleasing, not necessarily from the municipality pushing it, but we also understand that these are not practical for every business model, and we still see a lot of what you see on the left-hand side here, where there is a lot of pressure coming around on livability and accessibility as a result of logistics. Next, please. So there's three main challenges that we have facing Amsterdam regarding logistics, which is complexity, fragmentation, collaboration, and coordination. If we look at complexity, then yes, indeed, no two supply chains are the same. Of course, all supply chains are demand and supply based, but depending on the type of industry, construction, for example, which we see here, then they'll have quite sequential supply chains. They begin with the foundations of what they need, and they'll order things as they keep on going. We see fragmentation. We as consumers are demanding much more smaller deliveries. We're demanding them more often. We're demanding much more just-in-time deliveries. Every industry has very different yet specific needs. It doesn't really matter if we're talking about construction or if we're talking about healthcare, if we're talking about restaurants and hotels, they've all got different needs. And indeed, they all have got very different forms of data and different tools that they're using, which makes it difficult for us as a city. And then collaboration, of course, is really an overarching thing, which is quite efficient. We see that a lot of these companies are trying to protect their intellectual property rather than the interests of the city. And what we see today, because of this fragmentation, is that you have multiple suppliers servicing the same streets, the same neighborhoods, multiple visits, multiple deliveries every day. Next, please. And then, of course, we have the rise of the white vans. In Amsterdam, we have around about 4,000 trucks and 30,000 vans every day, representing about 15% of our total traffic and about 30% of our carbon emissions. And again, coming back to this notion of fragmentation, it's really about demand-based deliveries where people are demanding things to be just in time, as fresh as possible, as quickly as possible, and they're not collaborating in any way, which means then that you see ever more of these vans that are coming around. And these vans are increasingly more and more empty because of the fact that the orders are getting smaller and smaller and more frequent. Next, please. So this is some of the ways in which we're trying to address it. This is what we call the mobility center of the future. And it's asking us to, as a municipality, to sort of rethink and reimagine how our public space works and the mobility systems within it. And if I start from the very bottom, what you see is that we have got in dark red, the physical layers, and then intersected with those physical layers, we also have the digital layers. So it starts with things like the infrastructure. It's bus lanes, it's tram tracks, it's roads, it's bicycle paths. It moves up to things like the traffic and the mobility control systems, traffic lights, boom gates, street signs. And then we move up towards the vehicles themselves, which are, of course, becoming ever more connected and more intelligent. And then we have means of which we need to be able to communicate, which is via the mobility services providers themselves, such as Google or Waze or TomTom or whatever it may be, navigation systems. And then all around this, what you have is these various experiments and way in which we are looking into this, because you have these digital layers that are intersected, this data aggregation that goes all the way through. And what we're looking into is things like geofencing, the role of hubs, the role of government within it, new and public-private collaborations, etc., and even the terms and conditions that are required to build these kinds of digital layers. Next, please. So I won't go into too much detail about this, but one of the projects that we're working on is Code the Streets. And Code the Streets is looking at this and saying, well, how do we create those information chains and those feedback loops in order to have those digital layers? So if we are therefore being able to eliminate what we see on the left, the traditional model of street signs, and then communicate via, for example, repurposing our streets that you see on the bottom for different uses and different times, and repurposing the curbs for different uses and different times, how do we get those communications out there? And so fundamentally what Code the Streets is doing is looking at how we can create these kinds of information systems and feedback chains and these feedback loops in order to create better management of the public space. And here you see a number of different examples of how that might work, but I won't go into that in the name of time. And the next slide, please. This is my final slide. This is where I'm predominantly working on. It comes back again to this notion of saying that we need to make the separation between organized industry and independent industry. When we talk about creating these kind of communication chains and information chains, we probably have a little bit more success or ability to do so with organizing industry based on the fact that they have got the platforms and the planning tools, that they've got data-driven supply chain management, they have hub strategies, some of these vehicles have transponders, etc. And that's a very different story when we look at the small and medium enterprise. So they're much more sort of mobile device-driven, navigation-driven, much more fragmented. They probably use distribution centers, and indeed, it's a lot more qualitative data that we can get from them rather than quantitative. So I'm setting up 2 living labs. One is called Citie as a Contractor, where we're going to explore these things which you see in the possibilities section. And the other one is called the Demand-Driven Marketplace, which is really focused about learning about the carrot and stick incentives for the long tail of logistics. And then I think that's probably about it.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Excellent. I have a whole range of questions, but I'll restrict myself to probably one key one. Well, again, and I like the idea of coded streets. I think it's a very, very powerful way of getting the message across. But the question I'd ask is, particularly on those smaller and medium-sized enterprises, when you approach them and start talking about data, what kind of reaction are you getting? You know, are they puzzled, surprised? Do they really engage? Or tell us a little bit more about your thinking and experiences there.
No, well, that's a very interesting question, because the reality is that we don't really know all that much about there, you know, and that's case in point. When we talk about the organized industry, we have ways in which we can fundamentally to track and monitor them and to be able to collaborate with them. But because these vans and these small and medium enterprise are very fragmented over lots of different industries, the real motivator is to try and understand how it is that they are conducting their business operations and what is it that is their actual drivers behind it. And within that, then we say, well, do you know what? If you are, for example, an independent grocer who goes every day to a distribution center, is there a way then that we can try and get you to collaborate so that actually that one van would go there and collect your order for you, as well as multiple other stores, so that there isn't multiple vans making multiple trips at multiple different times. So it's more about trying to create a cooperative amongst these small SME players that can actually challenge large retail, rather than trying to get the sort of more data-driven solutions that we look for with organized logistics.
Excellent. Again, thank you very much. We'll head on to our next speaker, and again, we'll bring back all these issues later on. Please, if you have any particular questions, put them in the Q&A box. But our next speaker is going to be David Leopold from Chicago in the US. David is a director of City Solutions at City Tech Collaborative, an urban solutions accelerator considering cross-industry challenges. He's worked at City Tech for the last 7 years, and previously he was a lecturer at the University of Illinois, as well as he's worked in the City of Chicago Department of Transportation for nearly 10 years on streetscape and sustainable design. David, welcome.
Thank you, Giles. I appreciate it. And really, it's a pleasure to be here among these leaders talking about some of the challenges that we've all experienced globally at the Curb. The next slide provides just a little bit of context about City Tech that I wanted to share. I think that's helpful in terms of how we've approached the curbside challenge. As Giles mentioned, I'm director of City Solutions at City Tech. We're an urban solutions accelerator that focuses on challenges in cities that are too big for any one organization to solve on their own. And I think curbside is certainly an example of that. We bring together and work with cross-sector partners from private industry, from academia, from cities, and use our methodology to bring together these groups to better understand challenges, develop and think through how technology or data can be applied towards new solutions, and demonstrate them in live test beds, either at our home here in Chicago or through our partner cities globally. We work in a couple of different areas. Today, we'll speak to our exact work in advanced mobility and some thoughtful work working cross-sector around the curbs. The next slide talks a little bit about how we've approached it. And in City Tech's model, we brought together a workshop that included all of our curbside users and thought leaders around the space. The delivery companies, the cabs, the rideshare companies, the cities, the tech corporations, the startups, all of the groups that have been thinking through and talking about challenges at the curb, what people are looking for and why they can't get that today. And And as we had and convened and processed that discussion, we found, in fact, that the one thing everyone had in common that was missing in terms of how they would like the curb to be in a future state was demand information. Much of our discussion has been around understanding supply. Where do we have space for what, and who gets what, right, in any given space? And oftentimes your value to a city in the marketplace is the amount of linear feet or square footage that you would get as a representation of your economic and political might, right, as you come into the cities themselves. What was more interesting to the group, and where we focused our work with some more detail on the next slide, Giles, is around how we understand demand and value. So for any given segment of curb, what are all of the groups that would like to use that space? Not only who's there today, but who would like to use it but can't, and maybe looking for a suboptimal solution or moving to another location. And once you have a sense of that demand, how do we then understand value? So who's trying to use it and what's it to them? Right? And those values are very different for the bottom lines of a delivery company, to a personal resident looking at accessing their home, to public transit that is providing a broader network benefit to the city overall. And very quickly you arrive on a split value, both of individual value, either to those users or to the adjacent properties, or a shared social value that comes from the sharing of that public resource that benefits all. Right, and sometimes things are a blur of the two. So we set out to create a solution that would allow us to bring together non-traditional data partners to get a perspective of curbside demand and value. And we brought together Here Technologies, Bosch, Stantec, Teralytics, Carrier Direct, which helps to represent and organize the freight industry, and Spot Hero, a parking data and reservation company. And we put together a study in our home in Chicago. And on the next slide, we'll show you a little bit of our focus area. We looked specifically at 7 core census tracts in our downtown area, representing diverse uses, but also diverse temporal needs. So curbs that obviously have different demands in the morning versus the middle of the day versus the evening, to understand how they're currently being used, and also what would be the optimal blend of use based on demand, and how that fits within the city's broader mobility strategy. Obviously, there's much depth to both how we did that, what data we used, and things like that. I'll share today some of the key takeaways. The next slide talks a little bit about the optimal mix. We started with curbs that were predominantly allocated to the car, transit, and delivery. And that was largely it. Loading zones were applied for and permitted to adjacent property owners for their exclusive use. In reality, if you look to the right, the users of the curb and who's trying to access it are much more sophisticated. Rideshare, transit, bikes, taxis, deliveries, much, much more. And we were able to look at, by those sub-geographies, at what the optimal blend would be by mode, and to start to think through the city's mobility goals, which is to say, to look at how we increase person throughput and package throughput as opposed to vehicle throughput. How do we most efficiently move people to a space, getting them to that front door access? And similarly, how do we do that for packages in a way that eliminates some of those empty vehicles that were talked about earlier, and things along those lines? Once we understood this optimized blend, we were able to look at several different ways of intervening to improve curbside management, ranging from space allocation to dynamic pricing to dynamic management of the spaces themselves. And when we looked at it, some of our results were actually a little bit surprising. We found, in fact, that based on demand, we were able to reduce loading spaces by 75%. Within the central area, largely based around the fact that the current loading zone practice was wildly inefficient. One space for one property for use only in one portion of the day. How can those be shared and better located, dynamically managed to allow for more efficient use? But it also opened up 250 new car parking spots, 250 new taxi spaces, EV docks for rideshare, bike share, along those lines. So the bottom line of what we found was that, in fact, the space is not currently optimized to meet actual demand of total mobility. And when you move to the next slide, when you take that into account, and if you look at pricing at the curb, if you look at incentivizing higher efficiency modes, dynamic management, things along these lines that benefit the broader human-centric city that we discussed earlier, in fact, it allows for cities to increase revenue relative to the management of that space. When we looked at the particular running of the model in Chicago, we saw a 50% increase in daily curbside revenues, largely looking at the ability to manage additional spaces and the ability to look at that dynamically throughout the day. So in terms of the lessons learned from Chicago and this model, we have now a product available with scalable data sets that can be applied globally for cities to understand better demand to then design their interventions. Some of the cities we're working with are looking at a total curb management approach. Others are looking at understanding what group might have the greatest demand for targeted interventions, for example, freight, rideshare, or other elements moving forward. But what we see is now tools and data from non-traditional partners allowing for better insights, better dynamic management, and more accurate pricing that can go to support both individual and public goals within a shared public space like the curb. So I'll end there. Happy to take questions and looking forward to continuing as part of the dialogue.
Thank you very much, David. A whole series of questions, but I'll ask particularly, do you feel your model will be applied regionally within Chicago or elsewhere in Illinois or the US? And how close do you think the US or other markets are at actively pricing the curb? Again, almost heading beyond the pricing the parking space, but pricing that valuable asset in cities.
No, it's an interesting question. I think we're speaking with several cities at the moment around their potential value and use of the model. Many cities in the US already price the curb. Chicago, we do through a public-private partnership, others through their own municipally run programs. I think more unique is a dynamic price. One that allows you to open up and think through various mode incentives or other things at different times. Where we're headed next, and I think where there's great opportunity, is that we sometimes assume that some of these challenges can only be solved in the streets. And we had a wonderful realization when we were looking at one of our focus areas, understanding, high demand area, what do we do with the curb? Not everything fits, right? At the end of the day, the street is sort of a 10 pounds of flour in a 5-pound sack, trying to figure out where it goes. What we realized is that this particular block was immediately adjacent to a parking structure, right? So we've sort of lost the idea a little bit to say where there are more prioritized uses, where else could demand go? And how do you think about coordinated pricing, coordinated management, and tools to be able to support that for a more integrated approach?
Thank you very much, David. So again, we'll bring back some of these issues into the question and answer at the end, but please type your questions into the Q&A box if you have any. But that said, we're going to head off to Julian Wheel from Stuart, a tech and last mile delivery company based in Europe and part of the DPT group. Julian is leading the sustainability effort of the company in the UK. He has a varied background in tech, startups, mobility, and aerospace. And this includes time at Via, ride sharing, as well as at Airbus Group. He is based in London in the UK. Welcome, Julian.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for welcoming me. I'm very happy to be here. I already learned a lot from the previous speaker, so thanks a lot for sharing your views. As Gail mentioned, I actually lead the efforts on sustainability for Stuart, which is a last mile delivery company. What I wanted to talk a bit today is kind of like what we are basically. And I think in the conversation we're having today is kind of like a small focus on the global picture of Curb that can provide some interesting insights and collaborations. So if you move to the next slide, I think, that's just an example from the World Economic Forum that is trying to, stress the issue. I think the group here and the audience know the issue very well. And Eduardo mentioned and described the problem in even greater detail. So thanks for doing part of my job here. But basically what we see in a nutshell is kind of like if we, from the demand side, we see more and more customers wanting faster and more goods being delivered, and COVID accelerated that very, very well. And if we continue in that direction without doing anything, we're going to have some big problems. One on the emission side, and the other side on the congestion. And so that basically leads us to think and explore how we can achieve that and reduce that while keeping serving the demand of our customers. So moving to the next slide, basically that's kind of like what we're trying to achieve here. And I think that is maybe slightly different from other companies where our core mission is really delivering logistics, but for a sustainable world. And that is quite core about what we're trying to do. Of course, there's a lot of things going into that sustainability, but we really want to have a view about shared, efficient, and reliable deliveries. And that resonated quite well with what the previous people of the panel mentioned around actually sharing more. That's what I heard a lot. And that is actually something that we should look at more. Moving on to the next slide. That is basically a quick element just to recap about how we work. So we are a B2B company. So we serve different customers from the food vertical to the grocery vertical to retail. And that is quite interesting because already from that audience, we can start to group, that demand, which generally is scattered around different providers, into one unique platform. Then we enable our customers to provide different time windows or delivery solutions to their end users, from an extremely fast deliveries in 30 minutes to 1 hour to next couple of hours or next day. And combining that kind of like demand, kind of like aggregation with that flexibility of different time window precision delivery help us optimize the equation in a way. By kind of like mixing, of course, the stores of the urban hubs we have and the fleet of geolocalized couriers. And I think that is quite interesting because, we are looking from an operation point of view about how we gather that and also how we leverage technology and supply and demand algorithm and dispatch to enable that connection to be as efficient as possible. Of course, I think, we're just touching the surface here and there's much more we could do, but I think that's really what we believe in. Moving on to the next slide, the kind of like when we think about kind of like what's coming up and what's next for our industry in terms of last mile delivery, those elements are very important for us. I think the first part, which is quite interesting in the market, is there's a need and a growing need and demand from the customers to have reliable and precision and fast. And when we think about those terms, that just make the equation harder. If you need to have all your goods in 10 minutes, like the new grocery kind of like players in the market, well, of course you need more vehicles and that can cause some challenges. So that's a very important part of the equation. But at the same time, we really have to, and I think we really have a duty as a company to support and develop green transportation in cities. And to do that, we invest quite heavily on that front. And what is interesting when you look at that element is that we don't own the vehicle. The vehicle are owned by the couriers. And so if we can help our couriers transition faster to green deliveries and greener deliveries mode of transportation, we're going to facilitate that transition for them in the work, but also for them in their daily life. And I think that is quite an interesting impact we can have. Of course, we invest also heavily in technology, and it's a bit related to what we mentioned before. We need to make sure that we provide good earnings to our couriers, good and attractive prices to our end customers. And the only way we can achieve that in a sustainable way is using technology like pooling, like great dispatch, so we can match that demand and not have the problem that Eduardo mentioned around white vans, for instance. And I think, our responsibilities sometimes go beyond that in terms of the community and the cities we live in. Humans are really at the core of the transportation, especially in the last mile delivery. And we always wonder how we can better support through supporting our couriers. But I think something that is coming out of that discussion quite well is how can we support with data as well and collaborate more to share that insights with cities and different players in the local area. Moving on to the next slide, just to give you a final note about where we operate. We are a very European today centric company. We have very large operations in the UK and in France. We have operation in Poland and Spain and growing in other 1,000 European countries in the coming months. So I'm going to pause here and give the mic back to Gilles and wanted to thank you again for the opportunity.
No problem. Thank you very much for joining us today. Again, a range of different questions, but I think I'm going to start with the one on when speaking to cities, and clearly you're working across Europe, what kind of conversation do you or would you like to have with cities around managing clearly your business, but the broader issue of deliveries and sustainability in cities? Almost, how would you like to frame that conversation with cities?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think, on our end, we really want to partner and work with cities, and that's a piece of work we're doing in different regions. We have specific programs with the mayor of Paris, for instance, around air monitoring pollutions. And I think, sometimes they tend to be kind of a disconnect between public actors and private actors. And on our end, I think we can bring a lot of value to the table. I think there's a huge value we can bring, and we would love to engage around data and information. To give you some example around that, when we think about, charging infrastructure in cities, and deliveries being kind of like a fast moving goods in cities, can we actually help better design the locations, or even go further and maybe work with some of our partners that have real estates in the cities to provide and also participate in that acceleration of green transportation in cities. And I think the way we can really achieve that as a group of stakeholders, and I think the colleagues here from the cities have mentioned that very well, is really through the collaboration. And I really believe in the idea of pilot and testing. Maybe that's my tech background. And so, enabling those conversations through, okay, let's take a bit of space in the city. Let's try to do this together and iterate based on the success or failure and learnings we see.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Julian. Again, we'll bring more questions in later on. I'd like to go to my final speaker for the presentations, and that will do the general discussion, and that's Astrid. So Astrid Caban is the head of development at Vianova for France, Belgium, and the LATAM region. She has a master's degree in civil engineering from Nancy and a master's degree in urban planning from École des Ponts Paris and École d'Urbanisme de Paris. She previously worked on improving transport networks and developing traffic forecast models for RETP Dev, CETEC International, and Transdev. The floor is yours, Astrid.
Thank you, Giles. So today I'm going to talk about how at Vianova we contribute to improving care management and urban logistics. And so can you go to the next slide, please, Giles? So Vianova, it's a startup company that was created 2 years ago. Today we are 18 people working for the company from different cities and countries across Europe. And our main objective is to facilitate the communication between cities, authorities, and urban logistic companies, shared mobility operators, and other connected fleet operators. So on the next slide, you see today we work with 20 cities across Europe. We have agreements with more than 50 mobility operators. And by facilitating the communication between those different parties, we aim to enable cities to take control, monitor, and value their public space. So at Vianova, we have a lot of experience working with shared mobility operators, and we realized that cities also have a real need to collaborate with logistic companies in order to better understand the needs and manage the space allocated to those companies. So we've had different interviews with cities. Next slide, please. With cities, so not only across Europe, but we also had interviews with cities in other countries such as Buenos Aires and Mexico. And we have two main observations. The first observation is that there are changes in curbside use with a lot of new vehicle types, and that results in many wide parking, safety risk, and congestion. And the other observation is that there are many changes in delivery practices with more frequent and shorter stops. So there is a real need of collaboration with cities, logistic companies, and that's why also we've had some interviews with leading logistic services. Next slide, please, Giles. And so you can see a few of them here, such as UPS or FedEx, and we've had some key learnings from those interviews too. So the first learning, which is not a surprise, is that this past year, there was a substantial increase in e-commerce deliveries. Some of the companies we've been talking to, they even saw an increase of more than 50% of their e-commerce deliveries. And the loading and unloading parking zones are not adapted anymore to the current needs. They are not at the right place, not the good size. They are not managed dynamically. And most of the drivers now, they need to double park in the street just to be able to deliver their packages. Many companies are also deploying new types of vehicles, such as electric vehicles or non-motorized vehicles. And so that also results in new needs regarding infrastructure, not the same, they don't need the same parking zones. Maybe they need charging stations, etc. And there is also a need of having real-time information about the availability of parking zones and real information about city regulations, which are dynamic regulations depending on the day, the hour of the day, the type of vehicle, etc. So we have identified several use cases. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about 3 use cases we've identified. So the first use case is the need of developing a data standard for curb and urban logistic vehicles data. So by developing data standards, we'll be able to develop our solutions easily in different cities and include all the logistic operators. And once we are able to collect those data, we can then get insights and better understand the logistic companies' needs, better understand why and where they have to double park. And we have the connected vehicles data in real time, and we'll also be able to have historical analysis. And we will see where are the main and even each delivery locations. Will be able to analyze the origin and destination of the delivery vehicles, at what time they happen, depending on the type of vehicle, depending on the day, on the suburb, etc. And with this data, we will also be able to see in which location we could implement, for example, micro hubs to allow remote storage, for example. Next slide, please, Giles. So today we are working with the city of Paris to better understand the needs of logistic companies, improve their infrastructure, and inform urban logistic vehicles in real time about availability and city regulations. And we have also started discussion with different cities across Europe, America, and Australia, defining use cases and sharing experience with both the cities and the logistic companies. And lastly, Vianova joined the Open Mobility Foundation Curb Management Working Group, and we are creating a standardized curb open data format, and we are really looking to partner with cities on those topics. So if you want more information, I'm happy to answer any question, and here are my contact details.
Thank you very much, Astrid. And not surprisingly, I'll ask you specifically on the Paris Ile-de-France project, if audience members, startups, delivery companies want to get involved, how does that process work, and can they get involved in the ongoing project?
Yes, so we have been in contact with different urban logistic companies, and so there have been difficulty, I had to admit, at the beginning to put in place that collaboration for different reasons, because it's a competitive field. So sometimes a logistic company are not willing to share their sensitive data. And our project that involves sharing data is it's very innovative, so the industry is not used to it yet. And also there is no obligation for the operators to share the data, so it really relies on their goodwill. So we had to develop a specific data sharing framework for those logistic companies. And so they can see that the benefits are both for them and the cities, and they are disposed to share the data on some conditions, such as anonymized data, etc. And there also was a concern about, for some operators, about the data formats and the compatibility of their system with the platform we are using, because each operator have its own system, but that are topics our technical teams can work on. And so we're happy to work with the logistic operators, and they can reach out to me if other operators can be part of the project, and also other cities.
Excellent, Astrid. And I'd like to open up that question to the rest of the panel now. Why haven't we seen the digitization of the curb up to now? And are the issues systematic or structural? Or frankly, how do you think we can overcome this issue on a European basis or on a global basis? And across the panel, who might want to start off? Perhaps one of the three cities? Efran or Eduardo, would you like to start maybe?
Suppose I can add on that. I mean, from my personal perspective, I think that there's been a number of elements where actually the industry of logistics has perhaps gone faster than what cities have anticipated, and that's also something which has been fundamentally a problem in its own right. You know, we need to be much better at looking at trends and really trying to anticipate what is coming our way. And certainly as a city, we've never really put the infrastructures in place for logistics. I mean, logistics has fundamentally been able to do whatever they want to do for decades. And as a city, we haven't really facilitated it in any way, shape or form. And so now what you're seeing is these kinds of reasonably new trends where there's all of these new modalities and new things that are popping up left, right, and center. And the city is somewhat scrambling still to try and figure out how to address all of these things. These 10-minute deliveries, for example, with the gorillas, there's a lot of debate that happens inside of the municipality of Amsterdam about whether or not this is the type of city that we want to be, because it is a new form of logistics in its own right. Should we be putting policy down there? And so this is what we're saying now is basically we need to try and create that kind of policy so that it's in a dynamic and digital way that is allowing to accommodate all of the different players and all of their different needs at different times.
Efran and David, I see your heads nodding. Would you, either of you, like to add any more?
Well, maybe not add, but just to confirm that indeed urban logistics has been a jungle up to now, and it has not been such a big deal up to now when we've been experimenting this explosion of e-commerce, which is something that we were not even talking about 5 years ago almost. Yeah, and that the COVID-19 pandemics has accelerated, I don't know, tenfold maybe. So also I think that up to now we did not have enough technological options to manage that in an efficient way. And also, let's say that everything related to mobility has a lot of drag, and it takes long time to move and to change. So yeah, it's been just that we have not taken the bull by the horns up to now, I think.
Thank you. I mean, David, do you want to add anything? I'm just keen to bring in Julian with a slightly different version of the question, but go ahead if you.
No, I think I agree, and I think that the curb and its management actually falls between a classic debate and challenge for cities, which is that the physical curb comes from capital dollars, but the operations and management of it are operating dollars, right? And those are two different types of funds for cities. And as a result, oftentimes the curb is governed by different organizations within a city. So if your meters are run by your finance department, your goals are revenue, right? If it's run by your transportation department, and its goals are capital and mobility, right, as they come into it. So oftentimes there's conflicting public policy goals. I think we were excited by our effort because it widened the aperture to the user groups and found that, in fact, for additional better services, data-driven, there's revenue there that could potentially connect the dots internal to cities to be able to support collaboration through tool sets.
Okay, thank you. And again, Julian, a slightly different take on the question. Again, having worked in other industries as well, what could we learn or should we be learning from other new tech mobility industries about this digitization and bringing it into the way we work on the curb? Are there any lessons you think we should be discussing?
I think that's, you know, I've never worked for a city of government, so it's harder for me to kind of like answer that. But the thing that comes to mind, I think, reflecting on what Ephraim was mentioning, for instance, is the speed and agility, right? Like, I think clearly private sector, especially around the tech companies, they move very fast. Generally, the classic motto is kind of like, you know, go and then learn by doing and iterate. And we've seen that with the e-scooters, for instance, in many cities where it was kind of like crazy and like it was everywhere and in the water, like and then regulation started. You had like parking lot, geofencing, and it became a bit more kind of like less chaotic. And maybe there's something a bit similar to what's happening with urban logistics. But I think what is very important indeed is to ensure that the stakeholders work together. And I really liked what I think David mentioned around understanding what the outcome. So I think once the outcome is well defined, for instance, how many goods or people we want to go through the city, then we can work together to achieve that goal. But defining the goal, I find it extremely powerful because that can rely people and contribute in a very good way. And I think private sectors really want to contribute and tech companies really, really want to help in that ecosystem.
And again, in terms of, again, across the whole panel, in terms of the data, who should be managing the data? Is this something cities should be leading? Is it third parties, Vianova in the world, or is it the delivery companies per se, or what is the balance between actually taking that data into a place where it actually is useful in this debate? Who might want to start on that? So perhaps David, I might go to you first.
I think on the data side, my personal view is that it would not be the cities. And I don't think cities necessarily want the data of the various curb users. I think they're looking for more of a coordination role. I think it's also very unlikely that the private groups will share certain data that may be helpful for total integration because of competition within the space itself. Several of the larger carriers are competing on minutes and seconds, right? So that is it's a fairly tight group. I think that the data around utilization, availability, and price can and should be shared universally to all those groups as a reflection of policy. And if there's some clear line around that and it's provided equally, I think that's relevant. And then I think the larger players, as was mentioned, will be sophisticated enough to ingest that and operate it within their own tools. And then there could be support given to smaller groups around how the city or other groups can be able to help provide support.
So I'm going to go to Eduardo, and then I'm going to go to Astrid. So Eduardo, you go first. In terms of a city, who do you think should be managing the data to make all of this work?
Yeah, look, the word data for a city, or for at least for Amsterdam anyway, is a highly ambiguous term. You know, we are absolutely drowning in data, but yet we are always apprehensive about what our role and responsibility is. And as a city, you know, we are civil servants who are actually mandated to serve the public. But at that same time, we shouldn't be seen to helping the commercial interests of one party versus another. So it always becomes very, very difficult when it comes to this notion of data sharing. What are we doing with it? We're always scared about GDPR. We're scared about like releasing something out there that we shouldn't be releasing. So I'm inclined to agree with David that as a city, no, we would like to take a little bit more on that means to be able to say that we want to be able to communicate the policy, the planning, the enforcement, but it's got to be based on our city values of, you know, safety and accessibility and livability, sustainability, etc. But But it is a real conundrum, of course, you know, because as a city, we cannot do it alone. We need help from external third parties in order to be able to get these innovations happening. But invariably, that thing always comes up in terms of where do we get the data from, who owns it, where does it go to, and it's something that we struggle with very, very much.
Thank you. Astrid, over to you. Do you know this view on this?
Yes, I totally agree with David and Eduardo. I think the city, they want to coordinate and manage the fleet on their territory, and they want to have the right tools to do that. And so they need a third party like Vianova to collect the data from the different parties, do the work to anonymize the data, standardize it, and provide it on a platform for the city to use with insights and tools such as implementing regulations in real time, communicate, and then be able to communicate through this tool easily with the logistic operators.
Again, thank you, Astrid. Sorry, we have about 10 more minutes. I've got a whole range of questions, and I'd like to give all the speakers a chance for their final thoughts. I want to throw in one comment, and I raised it at the very beginning. So much of the debate around deliveries is coming back to electrification, and obviously that's very important for CO2 reduction. But how do we broaden this debate to all of those wide range of user cases, such as was in Eduardo's presentation, and the impact of all of these uses on livability, space in cities? And almost even if you move to e-cargo bikes, you still need room for e-cargo bikes in cities. You know, how do we go to stakeholders, the EU and others, and actually widen this conversation? And again, maybe I'll start with you, Julian, as an operator, on your initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think first it's interesting to, you know, I think the view generally on the cities is really like the public goods and how we serve the citizens. The view of a company is generally how you serve your shareholder and how commercially that can be done. And what I find interesting, I don't think those two things are, you know, in contradiction. Basically, what you're saying in terms of asset utilization, right? Like, basically, there's a strong incentive to always have those type of vehicles rotating, never stopping, never being parked for long, because, you know, that's how you utilize your asset better. And that's also how you minimize the idle time or unused public space. And that is quite interesting. Generally, we see things in contradiction. I think they are much more aligned overall. Another example of that is, you know, operating cost. When you look at the purchasing of an electric vehicle, that has a green premium today. And, you know, it's expected to stay for kind of like, you know, 2, 3, 4 years. And I think there's a role, a leadership role to take from companies like Stuart, but also cities are doing that to help with that transition. But once you've done that transition in terms of operating costs, it's much better, right? And so it's much better for the business and it's much better for the cities and the environment. And so again, those things are aligned. And I think that is quite an interesting perspective that, you know, to appreciate that alignment.
Okay, and Efren, again, I'm just keen that Barcelona is so well known for its livability and pedestrianization and better use of space. Perhaps some comments on this issue of electrification, but actually wider issues of managing the curb. What would be your thoughts?
Well, I cannot tell you much yet on electrification. I'm quite sure that it will take a lot of space in the end. But if by doing that we remove lots of cars, I think it's even it out, and we might even get an advantage in that case. What I wanted to take to the table is an idea that, well, as we in Europe like a lot regulation, take in mind that one of the options that is being handled, at least in Barcelona, is to make a public concession for a single operator within the city. So no more lots and lots of different enterprises moving around, but trying to, as I said, we like in Europe, regulate. And we do that by making a public concession with one single operator. And I don't know to what extent this is a good idea or not in the end. I mean, in theory, it seems good. In practice, I don't know. And this also goes back to the issue of who provides data and which data. In such a scenario, I would say that it's a duty of the city itself to provide things like the sensors. So the raw data needs to come from the public infrastructure, and maybe then the management of that data can go through a third party that is able to do that properly, because we don't have tech sections in the municipalities yet that are able to do this kind of things. And of course, in the end, it's up to the distribution company that to use that information to optimize the routes. I see that very clear in this scenario. I don't know exactly how to do that when you have competition, because then it's more complex. I'm talking now with the point of view from the point of view of a public servant, which I'm not, because I work for a private company, but in this case I'm representing the city, so it's a bit of a mixed situation right now.
Actually, and along those lines, again, we're sadly, as always the case, we only have about 5 more minutes, and I'd like to give everybody just a chance for the final thoughts of the overall discussion. We have a comment on creating tools, policy and digital, to meet the needs of the city. And perhaps if you think about that in your final summation as well. But starting again with Efren, do you want to just kind of finish off with any other thoughts you might have about what we've talked about over the last hour that you'd like to share with everybody before we wrap up?
In fact, I was just starting to type an answer to the question that we have on the panel by Kelly. The question is exactly, how do you create tools, policy, and digital that meet the needs of the city? And I was going to say that first you need a dialogue with stakeholders, and this is something that does not happen too often, at least in Barcelona and surroundings, and especially because this urban logistics is something which is very new to the local governments. They have never tackled the issue up to now, and so they don't know a lot about it, and it's a bad idea. I'm always talking from the experience in the south of Europe. I don't know in the rest of Europe how's the situation. I hope it's better. But the thing is that we need this dialogue in order to produce the tools that are really useful for the end users, because in the end, we need to move cargo around and to serve the people with their needs. But this case, I would say that the first and most necessary thing is to have this dialogue in order for you to know what needs to be done. And this is a process that in Barcelona we're doing very slowly, but at least it's start. We've been starting to make some roundtables where we talk we try to talk with everyone and to get a measure of these needs.
Thank you, Efren. And now if I go to David, actually, your final thoughts overall.
No, thank you, Giles. I think in general, the curbside conversation is the reflection, at least in terms of my view at City Tech, around a broader shift where with the types of sensing technology, data, and tools that are now available, it's allowing cities to go from a passive management to a proactive management of streets, of traditional city roles, which asks a lot of questions around how and to what end, right? So it refreshes the very notion of the role of government in streets, for example, and other things, you know, primarily in the US around sort of the health, safety, and welfare of that shared asset for all users within the city itself. So as we look at demand-based solutions that can be enabled by technology and by the private sector, there are open questions of public goals. And how do we then similarly address areas of low demand? And how do we ensure equal access throughout a city overall? So to Kelly's question a little bit, I think some of that comes in how we express our policy and how we do that. Is data similarly an asset that is shared alongside a physical asset? How do we promote for standards and other things and support organizations like the Open Mobility Foundation and others, where cities are talking to one another about shared and common goals? And then I think to Efrain and others, as you're looking at partnerships and contracts, what should be the city's role versus private, and what do you incentivize monetarily versus require from a regulation point of view around the obligation of government, right, to represent its people throughout the city overall. So I think, you know, in closing, I think this is a really exciting opportunity because it's an opportunity for cities to reinvent themselves on the same goals that we've already had in the first place. And what does that look like within a fresh and modern perspective?
Thank you very much, David. And if I then pass to Julianne, if you could be relatively brief, but your final thoughts.
Yeah, first, just wanted to thank you again and really like enjoyed a lot like learning from all the panels. So thanks a lot for sharing this conversation. I think, you know, one belong, but I think what I hear and what is very, very important is aligning on outcome. And I think there's a huge power in companies like Stuart to actually, you know, double down on the policies that the city put in place. I'm taking an example on the electrification of the fleets and, you know, generally the subsidies about getting electric vehicles, kind of like, because we have use case for those vehicles, we can accelerate and double down on that and also support the policies to accelerate that transition. And I think there's a lot of very interesting things we can do together to make actually the cities we are all in kind of like better for everybody. And at least that's actually what I think, you know, our role is. It's not, you know, just towards the shareholder, but also towards our communities and how we can make them better.
Thank you, Julian. And then to Eduardo.
Yes, once again, thank you very much as well from my side too. We have over here, I think one of the main challenges that happens with curbside management, logistics in general, of course, is that from a municipality, we have a lot of different departments dictating a lot of different policy coming from a lot of different areas, and it's been very confusing for the industry. They struggle with all of the various things. They're sort of drowning in different kinds of policy. So one of the things we've done is to basically set up our website, which is Logistics 020. And the objective behind this is really just to say that as a city, we want to speak to the industry within one voice and create one standard framework, one overarching policy. Within that, of course, then you have, you know, sort of the overarching policy of the city. But what's important for us as well is to be able to keep on experimenting with the ability to get those digital rules out there. And that's particularly relevant when we talk about saying, for example, that we want to direct a vehicle away from our vulnerable infrastructure, that we create those dynamic loading and unloading zones for them to be able to deliver at certain times of the day, geo-fenced, time-fenced times of the days, etc. And so again, this really comes back down to making sure that we have got the right kinds of information chains and feedback loops that we can actually put forward to the various stakeholders in the supply chain.
Thank you, Eduardo. And finally, but to Astrid. You're still on mute, Astrid, I think.
Yes, thanks, Giles. I agree with what has been said. To create a policy, you need to better understand the current activity on your territory, and it not only that's not only done with the data, but also by communicating with all the stakeholders, making sure, as David said, you have the same goals, but also discussing and sharing experience with other cities too. I think that's a very interesting conversation. Thank you, Giles.
Thank you very much, Astrid. And again, we're just a few minutes over time, so I will wrap up. Again, I'd like to thank David Leopold from City Tech Collaborative, Julian Wheel from Stuart, Frank Lara from McCreek Consulting, Eduardo Green from the City of Amsterdam, and Astrid Caban from Vianova for joining us today and sharing some of their thoughts on the challenges of managing curb space in cities and taking a data-led approach. Please listen to our earlier Vianova webinars and read our white papers and articles, which are available on our website or LinkedIn page. They contain useful insight on new mobility from our partners across Europe and the wider world. There is a satisfaction survey with this webinar, which is on your screen now, and please fill it out. It gives us useful insight for future webinars. And our next webinar actually will be on July 22nd, and we'll be looking at e-scooter trials in the UK, 1 year on. Please join us. Thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon. Keep safe and enjoy the rest of your summer. Bye-bye, everyone.
you all. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.